Thanks everyone for coming to this session, the final session for today. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce John Heil, who's giving this keynote lecture, who really, I guess obviously doesn't really need any introduction, being the author of an enormous number of very influential papers and books really across the whole field of metaphysics, philosophy of mind, epistemology, logic. Is also, a great friend of Australasian philosophy, a fellow of the Academy of the Humanities of Australia. So it really is really wonderful to have him here giving this keynote, and he will talk to us about grasping at gaps.
So thank you very much. Before I start, let me just say that I've got 4 copies of this paper. If I had a handout, but all the handouts are gone. So, but anyone who is dying to see more about this can pick up a copy of the paper. Okay, and I'm going to start with I want to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples as traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the explanatory gap. And so I'm going to say, take the explanatory gap, please. Starting off with and lots of these quotations are on the handout if you have that. There is a hard problem of consciousness. In fact, there are many, but these are scientific in character, not metaphysical. The metaphysical problems of our own manufacture. And that's just a quotation from an elderly philosopher. Okay. Okay, we who call ourselves philosophers can benefit by occasionally stepping back from the front lines and reflecting on how we came to be the philosophers we came to be. What I have in mind is not a matter of self-serving autobiographical curiosity. Rightly done, reflecting on our past can shed light on the character of what we take for granted. In particular, what we take for granted in pursuing issues that arise precisely because we take for granted what we do. And this is a quotation from C.A. Strong. A philosopher is commonly thought of as a reasoner, but I would rather conceive him or her as a person careful in his assumptions, or in her assumptions, their assumptions, I guess I should say. This thought came to me recently in the course of serving as an external reader of a PhD thesis. The details are not important. Sorry, I'm all tangled up. The details are not important, but among other topics, the thesis addressed the question of whether panpsychism whether panpsychism provides a sensible way of spanning the explanatory gap. For those of you fortunate enough not to be familiar with the expression, the explanatory gap is a label philosophers use for the epistemological gulf separating the hard-edged nature of the material cosmos and the gauzy character of conscious experiences. How can you get from the one to the other? In reflecting on the line taken in the thesis, I underwent a kind of philosophical epiphany. One result of it is this paper, for better or worse. I've learned to trust, at least respect, my gut feelings. I'm parroting John Bigelow here. When it comes to metaphysics, C.B. Martin, Charlie Martin, liked to say that metaphysics was done down here, pointing to a substantial belly not up here, pointing to his head, which housed a substantial brain. In the same vein, Charlie observed that you did not really understand a position until you could live it. By this, he did not mean you had to accept a position to understand it, but you had to feel its visceral pull. A position that exerted no such pull would lack credibility. In my own case, I've found that the best way to understand what I really think about a topic that evokes a strong reaction in me is to sit down and try to explain the topic to myself. If I can understand it, anyone can. Sometimes this results in my concluding that my reaction was justified. More often, it leads me to see that my reaction was either uncharitable or simply off base. In what follows, I invite you to judge the efficacy of this practice. Okay, section 2 is on Leibniz repurposed. Jonathan Schaffer begins a recent paper with a much quoted passage from Leibniz. This too is on the handout. Everyone must admit that perception and everything that depends on it is inexplicable by mechanical principles, by shapes and motions, that is. Imagine there were a machine which by its structure produced thought, feeling, and perception. We can imagine it as being enlarged while maintaining the same relative proportions, to the point where we could go inside it as we would go into a mill. But if that were so, when we went there, we would find nothing but pieces which push one against one another and never anything to account for perception, Schaffer reckons that this passage amounts to an 18th century acknowledgement of an epistemological and metaphysical chasm between characteristics of material bodies and characteristics of conscious experiences, phenomenal qualities, qualia, right? Think about the load that those terms carry. In this, Schaffer is certainly not alone. Leibniz is commonly taken to epitomize the kind of unshakable dualist convictions that issue in what David Chalmers calls the hard problem, the problem of finding a place for conscious experiences within a material cosmos. Colin McGinn exemplifies this attitude when he asks rhetorically, how can technicolor phenomenology arise from soggy gray matter? This reading of the quoted passage is, I believe, mistaken, but I shall postpone discussion of Leibniz and focus first on the explanatory gap and its deployment by philosophers in the service of various metaphysical projects. Okay, section 3, the explanatory gap. The explanatory gap was so named by Joseph Levine in the course of examining the relation conscious minds bear to material bodies. Levine set out to transform an influential metaphysical argument advanced by Saul Kripke against mind-body identity into an epistemological counterpart. Kripke held that if A and B are identical, that is, if A is B, A and B could not have failed to be identical. A could not have failed to be B. In the idiom of possible worlds, if A is B, then there's no possible world in which A occurs and fails to be B, and vice versa. Channeling Descartes, Kripke argues that we have no trouble conceiving of minds without bodies. So we have every reason to allow worlds in which minds are not embodied. Hence, the identification of minds and bodies fails. Levine doubts that the Cartesian intuition that minds could exist apart from bodies supports Kripke's conclusion. What it does support, however, is the quotation, a closely related epistemological thesis, namely that psychophysical identity statements leave a significant explanatory gap, and as a corollary that we don't have any way of determining exactly which psychophysical identity statements are true. Many of you will be familiar with what comes next, so I shall be brief. Suppose you thought that pains were goings on in the brain, C fiber fires. Those were the old examples. This is at best a contingent truth. Functionalists long ago established to the satisfaction of many that type identities were not on the cards. Creatures with very different physiologies could plausibly experience pain. Pain is multiply realizable. To be in pain is to be in a state that plays the pain role, a state brought about by heat, pressure, or tissue damage, for instance, one that produces aversive thoughts and behavior. The material nature of such states could vary across species. This leaves open the possibility of token identities. However, an individual creature's pains might be identifiable with whatever state plays the pain role in that creature. This, in fact, was the position endorsed by David Armstrong and David Lewis. Suppose then that you had evidence, and I should say this. This is David Armstrong's birthday. Today is. If he were alive, he would be 99 years old. So next year will be the centennial of David Armstrong's birth. Suppose then that you had evidence that in a particular case, an occurrence of C fibers firing played the pain role. What would support the identification of this instance of pain with an instance of C fibers firing? Levine compares this case to one discussed by Kripke, the identification of heat with molecular motion. The felt contingency of the connection between heat and molecular motion can be explained away, presumably by a detailed inspection of heated bodies. Nothing of this kind is available in the mind-body case. Neither closer inspection of the brain of someone undergoing a conscious experience, nor careful introspection by the one undergoing the experience would illuminate or explain how conscious experiences could be identified with brain states. It's the explanatory gap. Okay, section 4, explanation and incommensurability. Levine's argument, together with arguments by Frank Jackson and others, underlie the widespread belief that conscious experiences are sui generis. Most philosophers and scientists accept that consciousness depends in some fashion on an appropriate material substrate, although there is disagreement. There is disagreement over whether this dependence is contingent. According to some, were the laws of nature different, a particle-for-particle duplicate of you, a fully conscious agent, might fail to be conscious. Others, panpsychists, argue that consciousness must be in on the ground floor. A conscious agent could not be constructed using only insensate components. I'm thinking here of Gale and Strawson. I shall return to panpsychism in due course. For the present, it is enough to recognize that all parties agree that the explanatory gap between characteristics of purely material systems and characteristics of conscious experiences is momentous. The dialectic here is instructive. It begins with a metaphysical argument against the identification of conscious states and material states that relies on conceivability. This is transformed into an epistemological argument centered on explanation. Levine sees this as a friendly move in support of the conviction that the relation between the mental and the physical is opaque.
Don't worry, it's just to activate the camera to see if we can do this. But continue, John. Don't worry.
Okay. Where am I? Levine sees this as a friendly move in support of the conviction that the relation between the mental and the physical is opaque. Conscious mental states appear to be add-ons, additions to whatever material states might be thought. We'll have to cut it off to.
Yeah. To edit it. Don't worry. The camera. It was just to activate the camera so they could see you, because at the moment they only see the slides, but they cannot see you.
Okay, so I'm going to go and I'm going to escape. And
Do you
now,
have to
can you
do that?
activate the camera?
On Zoom.
And that's it.
Oh yeah. Okay, so it's visible now.
So we're good.
Now we are good. Yeah.
Okay.
Now they can see you. All right.
This line of reasoning, in both its metaphysical and epistemological guises, is recognized by its advocates as falling short of conclusiveness. The aim, however, is to establish that anyone who hopes to identify the mental with the physical bears a non-trivial burden of proof. How could conscious experiences possibly be material states and processes? How would that work? In the case of heat and molecular motion, there's a story to tell, but no comparable story is available in the mental material case. The difficulty differs in kind from difficulties scientists encounter every day in endeavoring to come to grips with the cosmos. It's rarely obvious how things work as they do and why they are as they appear to be. It can take years to reach even a tentative understanding of a particular material system, state, or process. In the case of consciousness, however, the difficulty strikes us, or strikes some, as not simply one of detail, one we could expect to solve by doing more and finer grained laboratory work. Quantum mechanics currently lacks a single agreed upon interpretation, but there is no shortage of candidates. In contrast, when it comes to conscious experiences and their relation to material states and processes, the situation is, if not hopeless, at least desperate. It's hard to know where to begin. Okay, section 5 is on panpsychism. Panpsychism enjoys a prima facie advantage here. You can see how ordinary objects could have mass. They're made up of particles that have mass. Similarly, if the particles were dimly conscious, it's no mystery that some of the things they make up are conscious. Consciousness would be the property of a complex because its parts are conscious. If complex creatures are conscious, their parts, ultimately the quarks and the leptons, must have it in them to give rise to such creatures. The quarks and leptons must have at least flickers of consciousness. Some panpsychists worry that even if conscious experiencing goes all the way down to the quarks and leptons, the explanatory gap resurfaces in the form of a grain problem. How do you get from tiny bits of consciousness to the kinds of unified conscious experiences found in sentient creatures? Whether or not this is a difficulty or whether or not it's serious, it's worth recalling the original motivation for panpsychism. You start with a puzzle of how something capable of qualitatively rich conscious experiences could be made up of parts wholly lacking in such qualities. One way to account for a complex entity having a particular characteristic C is to accept that its parts, or some of them, are also C. So if your starting point is the particles, this might be true in the case of mass, but is certainly not the case, not true in the case of many unremarkable characteristics of complex objects. Their colors, for instance. Why imagine that conscious qualities are like mass and not like colors? A beetroot is red, roughly spherical, and pungent, despite none of the particles making it up being red, spherical, or pungent. Two common reactions to examples of this kind are worth mentioning. Consider the beetroot's color. It's sometimes claimed that the beetroot's redness is not in the beetroot, which is after all made up of colorless particles, but in the minds of perceivers. Philosophers speak of phenomenal redness and red qualia, distinguishing these from characteristics of objects thought to produce color experiences in suitably equipped perceivers. If experiences, but not beetroots, can be red, however, this would seem to require the particles' conscious qualities to be colored. How else could they give rise to colored experiences? Pancolorism. If, however, you accept that colorful experiences could result from assemblages of non-colored components, then why resist the thought that conscious qualities generally could result from assemblages of non-conscious particles? Sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. A second, perhaps more common and down-to-earth response is that this is a problem only because philosophers make it one. We know, after all, that when you arrange insensible particles in the right way, you get something red. We know this not because we have derived truths, extracted truths or derived truths about colored objects from truths pertaining exclusively to colorless particles and their characteristics, or because we can see, make sense of, or because we can see how you could get something colored from colorless somethings. We know it because we know that if you dismantle a red beetroot, eventually you arrive at colorless particles. This is the way the particles work. Their working this way stems from their natures, not from their obeying add-on laws of nature, underlying the production of colors. Among other characteristics, the particles have it in them to combine in ways that result in colored objects. Panpsychos might consider that the story does not begin with quality particles. Deep space astronomy enables us to look back on the universe as it was only millions of years after the Big Bang. What you find are not particles, clumps of matter, planets and galaxies, but microwave radiation. Eventually, material bodies, along with their qualities, congealed from this. Particles, together with their qualities, were formed from a material precursor that itself lacked them. Panpsychos professed not to understand how conscious qualities could arise in complex creatures unless they were present in the parts, presumably the particles, making up those creatures. But the particles themselves apparently came from something, microwave radiation, say, lacking qualities of familiar particles. If quality particles could evolve from microwave radiation, why think it impossible that experiential qualities appear only with the advent? Why think it is impossible that experiential qualities could appear only with the advent of conscious living organism? Section 6. I want to talk about distinctions of reasoned reason. There is an explanatory, that is an epistemological gap between the cosmos as described by physics and the cosmos we encounter as we go about our lives and make observations using instruments and laboratories. The gap has nothing to do with the special character of conscious experiences. It stems from our deployment of incommensurable modes of description and explanation in physics, biology, psychology, and the various special sciences, and in everyday life. The incommensurability of what Wilfrid Sellars called the manifest and scientific images. It's an incommensurability in conception, not in reality. I should add that although I am partial to Sellars' labels, I'm not. Sellars was a reductionist, and I'm not. This is how philosophers as different as Spinoza and Donald Davidson have seen it when it comes to the mental and the material. According to Davidson, the mental material distinction is a distinction in conception only. What the scholastics and early moderns called a distinction of reasoned reason. So if and distinguishing it from a real distinction. So Descartes says there's a real distinction between extended things and mental things, for example. If A and B are really distinct, either could exist in the absence of the other. This is what Descartes and by extension Kripke have in mind in declaring that there is a real distinction between conscious substances and extended material substances. Davidson, in contrast, holds that although mental and physical predicates differ in their application conditions, any event that could be truly described in a mental idiom answered as well to a physical description. Davidson understands this as a substantive thesis, the plausibility of which stems from its providing a way to see how reasons could be causes of actions. Causation, Davidson thinks, is a relation among events that fall under strict exceptionalist laws. Only physical events satisfy this requirement. There are no strict mental physical or mental laws. Strict laws concern events under physical descriptions. Mental events could figure in causal relations only if they were physical, only if they answered to physical as well as mental descriptions. The mental realm is anomalous with respect to the physical. However, there's no systematic mapping between mental and physical categories, hence no prospect of strict laws capturing relations among events described in a mental vocabulary. Now, I'm not endorsing Davidson, but I'm just using him as an example. Functionalists are happy to accept the anomalousness of the mental. What functionalists would not accept is the further thought that events are mental or physical only as described. Davidson had his share of critics, but I cannot recall anyone's invoking the explanatory gap and disputing his position. There is a gap. In fact, Davidson insists upon it, but he does not regard this as a barrier to the identification of the mental and the physical. It simply reflects a lack of alignment between our mental and physical, linguistic and conceptual repertoires. You might be unmoved. I expect you are unmoved, but Davidson's target was the propositional attitudes, beliefs, desires, and intentions. There's no special barrier to seeing how these could be identified with physical states of agents. The problem arises because experiential phenomenal states, qualia, exhibit qualities not to be found in the realm of matter. Such responses are disingenuous. The explanatory gap issues from the conviction that there's no prospect of explaining consciousness in purely physical terms. Can you see how a given physical state exhaustively characterized in a vocabulary drawn from physics could constitute a belief or any other propositional attitude? For that matter, is it obvious how something with all the familiar qualities of water results from combining hydrogen and oxygen atoms? These notable epistemological and semantic facts lack metaphysical import and bring with them no momentous shifts in the burden of proof. 7, the knowledge argument. One way to appreciate what the issue is, what is at issue here, is to reflect on Frank Jackson's influential thought experiment in which Mary, a brilliant neuroscientist, is, as he puts it, for whatever reason, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires, let us suppose, I'm still quoting, all the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, or use terms like red, blue, and so on. Eventually, Mary escapes her black and white environment. Will she, Jackson asks, learn something new about color, the focus of her research? The answer is obvious. Of course she will. Mary will learn what it's like to experience colors. This is not something Mary could have extracted from the physics and neurophysiology of color and color experiences. Given that, as Jackson puts it, Mary knows all the pertinent physical facts prior to leaving the room. Facts about what it's like to experience colors must be non-physical. Mary's vast knowledge of the nature of colors and color vision assuredly leaves her in the dark about what it would be like to undergo a color experience. This is not something extractable from the physical facts, so the qualitative character of color experiences, if not experiences themselves, must be non-physical. Again, we are offered an expressly epistemological argument and invited to draw a metaphysical conclusion. Imagine a different Mary, a Mary who has undergone the sorts of experience ordinary observers undergo. This Mary knows everything there is to know about the physics of beetroots, but has never encountered a beetroot. This Mary would undoubtedly be surprised to learn what beetroots are like on first encountering one. The prospects of deriving the character of a beetroot from a detailed description drawn from physics are vanishingly small. But there is no temptation to regard beetroots as non-physical or to imagine that they are something dependent on, but distinct from, the particles arranged in just the right way. Why, if beetroots are unexceptionable, are conscious experiences regarded as deeply fraught? You might worry that this has all gone too quickly. Well, I doubt that Mary would be unable to work out what beetroots are like in the advance of encountering one. After all, Mary knows enough about the physics of things that are a lot like beetroots in various ways. Cricket balls, red cabbages, peppers, and onions, for instance. It would not be unreasonable to suppose that she could infer her knowledge of the similarities. And this is the second Mary, the one that has been exposed to colors. It would not be unreasonable to suppose that she could infer from her knowledge of similarities in the physics of these things and the physics of beetroots what beetroots must be like. Maybe so, but the worry is misplaced. If Mary can work out what beetroots are like, she does so not from the physics alone, but only with the aid of her knowledge of all those other beetroot stand-ins, all those other beetroot stand-ins are like. The physics gives her the relevant similarities, perhaps, but the physics is silent on what beetroots are like. Mary's working that out is not a discursive process, but one that relies on imagery and previous experiences. So again, why, if beetroots are unexceptionable, are conscious experiences regarded as intensely mysterious? Section 8, what is what it's like? Part of the answer to this question lies in understanding what its likeness. You could work out what it is like. Could you work out what it is like to ride a bicycle or do a backflip from a detailed physical description of these activities? Knowing what it is like to ride a bicycle, do a backflip, or experience colors is not a matter of coming into possession of a description, physical or non-physical. If of these endeavors, it is a matter of doing or undergoing them. Nothing of metaphysical import follows from the presence of a gap between descriptions of a state and knowing what it's like to be in that state. I leave it to you to work out how you might extrapolate from your knowledge of what it is like to engage in similar activities to a sense of what it would be like to ride a bicycle or do a backflip. Even if all this is right, we're still faced with the nagging difficulty of understanding how experiencing red or undergoing a painful sensation could possibly be identified with a physical state. Were you to inspect my brain when I'm in pain or looking at a beetroot, you would detect nothing remotely like my experience. It is not just that you could not determine the character of my experiences from a careful examination of my brain. That is the explanatory gap. And while it might be epistemological in character, its presence has a metaphysical explanation. We cannot extract the nature of experiences from descriptions of physical states because it is unfathomable. This is the explanatory gap I'm not advocating. Because it is unfathomable how those states could possibly be experiences in all their technicolor glory. Section 9, experiencing experiences. Ask yourself what it would be like to observe, to experience another's experience. Suppose Mary is visually apprehending a red beetroot in bright sunlight. Mary is experiencing something red. Suppose in addition that whenever Mary, along with other ordinary human observers, experiences something red, her brain goes into a certain state, R. You, armed with a state-of-the-art scanning electron cerebroscope, are observing R. You're happy to say that R is correlated with Mary's experiencing red, but how could Mary's being in R possibly be her experiencing red? Mary's experience of red is nothing at all like R. Well, what would you expect an experience of red to look like? An experience of red, supposing it's a brain state. Would you expect it to be red? Would you expect Mary's visual experience of a beetroot to be something like a tiny picture of a beetroot in Mary's brain? Were you to discover such a picture, would it, the picture, be a candidate experience? Mary's or anyone else's visual experience of a beetroot is not itself like a picture of a beetroot. The beetroot, not Mary's experience, is red. The fact that an experience lacks the character of what is being experienced should be unsurprising. The fact that R differs qualitatively from the object of Mary's experience, R is neither red nor roughly spherical, is itself no barrier to the identification of R, that's her brain state, remember, with her experience. All in place, dubbed the mistake of conflating qualities conflate experience qualities and qualities of experience. He called this the phenomenological fallacy. This was back in 1956. The temptation to do this, the temptation to conflate experienced qualities and qualities of experiences is abetted by the kinds of epistemological consideration in play in invocations of the explanatory gap. What of experiences that themselves exhibit a distinctive mental character? Painful experiences, for example, feelings of nausea. How could the character of such experiences be identified with neurological goings-on? Again, it is crucial to distinguish being in a particular state from someone's observing that state. If you're undergoing a painful experience as you're being in a particular neurological state, there's no reason to think that someone observing that state could solely from the observation work out what it is like to be in that state. It is hard not to think that resistance to the idea that pains could be brain states stems from the thought that if pains were brain states, observing them would have to be painful. I hope you will agree with me that such a thought is illicit. Something's being in a state is one thing. Observing a state something is in is something else altogether. This, together with the fact that you cannot deduce what it would be like to be in a state from detailed physical descriptions of the state, conspire to produce Levine's feelings of contingency, and the sense that conscious experiences could not be identified with physical states. So remember, identity is not reduction or elimination. To describe the mind-brain identity theory as a form of materialism ignores the symmetrical nature of identity. Charlie Martin, a one-time colleague of both Place and Smart, Jack Smart, early proponents of the identity theory, like to cite a cartoon in which two people are conversing. The first says, when two people are married, they become one. The second, mulling this over, asks, which one? If water is H2O, H2O is water. Identifying water with H2O is not to reduce or eliminate water. It is to spell out what water is. If experiences are brain states, some brain states are experiences. None of this supports panpsychism, or for that matter, idealism. Panpsychism errs by starting with the thought that mental qualities are sui generis, then locates them at the root level. Why go along? What exactly are the qualities of experiences as distinct from qualities of what is experienced? What are the qualities of your visual experience of a beetroot? Do these differ from the qualities of your visual experience of an avocado? And if they do they differ in ways that would block the identification of experiences with occurrences in your brain? Invocations of what its likeness are beside the point. If the mental physical distinction is one of conception only, not a real distinction, a distinction of reason to reason, panpsychism is beside the point, just as pan-materialism would be. Section 10, back to Schaffer. I began with a quotation, Schaeffer, yeah. I began with a quotation from the Monadology, brandished by Jonathan Schaeffer, and a paper that addresses some of the topics I've been discussing. Schaeffer argues that explanatory gaps are in fact everywhere, even in cases, the identification of heat with molecular motion, for instance, invoked by philosophers who consider the gap between the mental and the material to be singular. I agree with Schaeffer's assessment but not with his reasons for thinking that gaps are ubiquitous, nor with his proposal for gap bridging. If I'm right, explanatory gaps are epistemological and semantic. Schaeffer, in contrast, regards them as metaphysical. Apparent gaps rise when you lack the appropriate substantive metaphysical bridge principles. These, he thinks, include a grounding relation, and quoting him here, a relation of directed dependency among entities, answering to the idea that there's not just a distinction between the more and less fundamental, but moreover a connection from the more to the less fundamental. Grounding names that connection. Schaeffer argues that if explanatory gaps between fundamental phenomena and less fundamental phenomena, what is that? Do you get fundamentality for free? You get contingency for free? When someone says it's contingent that I'm standing here now, is it? I mean, for me not to be standing here now, lots of other things would have to have been different. Could they have been different? Well, for them to be different, lots of other things would have to be different. So, I mean, this is just an example of the point made by a point made earlier that we need to look at our presuppositions carefully. Schaeffer argues that if explanatory gaps between fundamental phenomena and less fundamental phenomena are characterized solely by reference to conceptual, logical, or a priori opacity, they are metaphysically OTOs. Moving from the fundamental things to the rest, he argues, calls for expressly metaphysical principles that systematically connect what is fundamental to what is less fundamental. Explanatory gaps, he says, are everywhere in nature, lurking in every concrete transition from more to less fundamental, to be bridged only by the addition of substantive grounding principles. Grounding principles are needed to determine whether there are derivative concrete entities at all and determine what they're like. The pertinent grounding connections are analogous to causal connections and being directed dependency connections. Causal connections bridge the gap between causes and effect. Grounding connections bridge gaps between the more and less fundamental. To get from hydrogen and oxygen atoms to water molecules, you need a principle that connects the atoms, duly related, to a less fundamental something, a molecule. These principles are metaphysically substantive. They compete in the metaphysical arena with nihilism, the view that all there is are the fundamental things. There are no molecules or beetroots, only particles duly arranged. Such principles are not provable or excludable a priori, nor are they extractable from physics. Their credibility rests on their having a role in the simplest and strongest overall position. This is not the place to take up grounding. In my view, the perceived need for grounding principles stems from conflating epistemology and metaphysics in a manner that reflects badly on both. The idea that science requires supplementing by metaphysics to accommodate identities across a conceptual guide evinces a kind of philosophical myopia, coupled with hubris best left in the seminar room. The scientific image, what you have in physics, is orthogonal to the manifest image. This is not something that calls for a grounding relation, a directed dependency relation between a fundamental level of being and one or more less than fundamental levels. The manifest in scientific images are images of the self-same cosmos associated with incommensurable projects. Vocabularies and modes of incommensurable projects, vocabularies, and modes of explanation. This is a point well appreciated by Leibniz. So section 11 is Leibniz. Leibniz redux. Earlier, I promised to say something about the excerpt from Leibniz's monadology that led off the discussion. My suggestion at the time was that it is a mistake to read Leibniz as adverting to an explanatory gap between conscious experiences or minds and the material cosmos. I'm not a historian, but even a moderately attentive reader can see that this is no part of Leibniz's project. 3 paragraphs before the quoted passage, Leibniz explains that the transitory state, which incorporates a multitude within a unity or within a simple substance, is nothing but what we call perception, which must be carefully distinguished from apperception or consciousness, as will become clear in what follows. From Leibniz. One model for the behavior of Leibniz's point particle-like monads might be the behavior of particles in entangled states. The particles behave as though they understood and anticipated the behavior of fellow particles, but they do so without interacting causally. The state of a particle over here reflects the state of a particle over there, although the particles are not in communication with one another. A monad's perceptions are states that correspond to the states of fellow monads as they evolve over time. And we're back to Leibniz. Now, this interconnection or this adapting of all created things to each other and of each one to all the others means that each simple substance has relationships which express all the others. And that is therefore a perpetual living mirror of the universe. Some monads are capable of degrees of apperception, awareness of their own states. And again, quoting Leibniz, all things conspire, as Hippocrates said, but a soul can only read within itself what is represented in it distinctly. It could never develop all at once everything that it enfolds, because it goes on to infinity. Given that the states of every monad reflect the states of every other monad, apperception can amount to what would ordinarily be called perception, both inward and outward. The evolution of a monad's internal states could not be a mechanical process. Mechanisms have interacting parts. The monads are partless simples. On such a conception, space is not a container, but a stage on which monads play out their careers. Space is an abstraction from the collective states of monads, their individual perspectives. Truths about spatial relations are made true by non-relational features of monads. Given that each monad mirrors every other monad, there's no place for indiscernible monads. If A and B have precisely the same perspective, then A is B. It's the identity of indiscernibles. You might regard a cosmology of this sort as beneath consideration, a non-starter founded on a miraculous harmony among monads. But the Newtonian postulation of forces among particles acting instantaneously and universally, the Newtonian, postulation of forces among particles acting instantaneously and universally in accord with an inverse square law is hardly an improvement. Two aspects of Leibniz's cosmology bear mention. The first is its apparent immaterialism. And second, and to my mind, more important aspect concerns the relegation of efficient causation and causal interactions to the manifest image. Although I find this second component of his cosmology attractive in many ways, and certainly worthy of further consideration, my aim is not to defend Leibniz's cosmology, but merely to point out that his observations about mechanistic explanations have nothing whatever to do with the latter day explanatory gap. Last short section. The more things change, ... I acknowledge that nothing I have said here is original. This is how it is in philosophy. The same points must be made and remade as ways of considering the cosmos and evolve. What is opaque at one time can be transparent at another time. What makes sense at one time might require substantial reformulation before it makes sense at another time. At present, we are captive to assumptions that make conscious experiences outliers, crying out for heavy-duty metaphysical maneuvers. Materialism and panpsychism are just two of the most prominent examples. As Wallace Matson and Peter King observe, the mind-body problem has not always been seen as a problem. Where Spinoza and Davidson write, were the mental and material distinction a distinction of conception only, a distinction of reasoned reason, idealism, dualism, materialism, and panpsychism would all be beside the point. Materialism begins with the thought that the mental material distinction is this distinction in reality. The mental is non-material and eschews the mental. However, identifying the mental and the material is not to eliminate the mental or reduce the mental to the physical. If A is B, B is A. Panpsychism tacitly affirms the mental material distinction before concluding that mental qualities pervade nature. Both materialism and panpsychism are founded on the dubious assumption that mental qualities are metaphysically fraught and, in consequence, must be either everywhere or nowhere. Thank you very much.